welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am here with the author of a really awesome, creepy book called The Haunting of Moscow House. It is, man, I don't even know how to describe it other than it is a classic gothic horror story, but it is set during or after the events of the Russian Revolution, which is a horror story in itself. So please introduce yourself and tell us about this book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jessica, for having me on the show. I'm really excited to talk to you about the book. Well, my name is Olesya Salnikova Gilmore. I'm a speculative historical fiction author, and my debut came out about 2 years ago now. It's called The Witch and the Tsar, and my second book is, of course, The Haunting of Moscow House. So yeah, you got that right. The way I think of the book is it is a gothic horror tale, very much historical as well. The story opens in 1921 Moscow, as you mentioned. The Russian Revolution just happened, followed by a very bloody civil war, and this is all on the heels of the First World War. And we meet these two sisters. We learn that they are former aristocrats. They are now called former people by the Soviet government, and they are selling off their family's possessions in order to eat. That same day on the streets, they meet a group of American men who we learn are part of an organization called the American Relief Administration, which is a real life organization. And they've just arrived in the city to help with the famine and general fallout from all this, political and civil upheaval. At the same time, the sisters go back to their house, which you learn is the stately, crumbling mansion. It's their ancestral home, and they've been allowed to keep living in it. Incidentally, a group of Soviet men move in, so a lot of things happen in the very beginning, and they're relegated to the attic of their home. So this kind of sets off the two storylines of the narrative: the supernatural storyline, which is the house awakens and starts to whisper about a past not as dead as they thought, in the form of hauntings. And then the other is the tension we already see in the beginning, which is the sisters kind of trying to survive, move on, find work with this relief administration. And of course, the house bringing them back into a past that, they frankly thought was dead and gone, which is extremely dangerous for people like them in the time that they are living in.
Yeah, it really was quite interesting. And I think I want to know. So with the book, it's very rich in history and ghosts. So like for you, how did you feel that the events of the Russian Revolution lent itself to a gothic horror story?
Honestly, I've always found this period in history extremely haunting. I think it's because it's the end of an empire and a very violent and bloody end. The murder, of course, of the Romanov royal family is always front of mind. Those beautiful girls uh, in the flush of youth and just loveliness. And it all just had an incredibly tremendous effect on me ever since I was young. So I didn't think I could actually write about it. When I came across the idea for the story, though, as you said, it just lends itself so perfectly to a horror story, to gothic fiction. It's real life horror that people experienced at the time. And, as I said already, revolution had happened, Civil War had happened, World War One. It was very cataclysmic time for people. The monarchy was just displaced by the Soviet government. And as I said, it was very bloody. Many people were killed. And by all accounts, cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg and others were absolutely ravaged after that. They were described as ghost towns. They were empty. People had either left or were homeless, or that there was this sense of the past hanging over this stark present, where, these princesses and countesses are selling off their jewels, as I have in the story. And then, of course, you have these counts and princes and generals and former super influential people that are working in the streets, shoveling snow or cleaning toilets. And so you have those little reminders of the past everywhere. And of course, you have these old noble houses that, sometimes contain the remnants of their noble families, their owners, and sometimes they're abandoned, taken over by the government. But in a lot of accounts, I saw that many of these houses were just completely wrecked after the events of the revolution and subsequent civil war, because you had so much pillaging. You had, gunfire, you had all of this stuff that really went through and just kind of ruined these beautiful homes. And so you kind of have this stark present living alongside the glory days, and you have this past very much alive in the present, and it just lent itself perfectly to Gothic fiction.
Yeah, and you do talk about, you'd mentioned uh, just that you would have these nobles who now would have these, menial positions. I thought it was interesting. So, you have the two sisters, Irina and Lilia, and their relatives have like a million different names, and they're like referred to as like the princess. And that to me blew my mind because, obviously when we think about the Russian Revolution, you mentioned the Romanovs before. People think specifically of the Tsar's family, the Romanov royal family. I guess I wanted to know, what was the hierarchy of the nobility pre-revolution? Were there just random cousins that were considered princesses, and how did that work? Because that fascinated me.
That's actually a very complex question. That's a very astute question of you. I'll try to simplify it to the best of my ability. So basically, before the revolution, let's just say even at the end of the 19th century, there was a very large noble class in Russia. It was very diverse, it was very varied. It even included foreign nobles. Some of the nobility was inherited, some of it was earned, but suffice it to say, this was a extremely privileged class. And like a lot of the noble and privileged classes in the world, it was one in service to the crown, to the Romanovs, to the Tsar slash the emperor, either in a capacity at court, in the military, or in some sort of administrative capacity. So at the top of this very large nobility was the aristocratic elite. So I had to look this up for the podcast because I was very curious about this too. And according to a really famous historian, his name is Douglas Smith, he's fantastic. He describes as this top of the nobility as about 100 families. And they just have extended, like, landed wealth. This we're talking about is extremely old lineage. They have vast lands across the Russian Empire. And of course, they have wealth that, I mean, like the gold toilet kind of wealth we're talking about. And so some were princes and princesses. These are kind of the real life Golitsins. This was my Golitsev family side of the family was based on this family. And they reached so they're basically the kind of ancient princely families that reach all the way back to the first rulers of Russia, the Ruriks, who basically had Viking blood in their veins. So this is a very ancient nobility. And then you had the kind of counts and countesses. This kind of came out of the non-titled boyar clans at the old Muscovite court before the court moved to St. Petersburg. And these were the Sheremetyev. That's the family that the Sherbatsky family is based on. And it's interesting because in my first book, The Witch and the Tsar, I actually have a boyar who's a member of the court at Ivan the Terrible's court, and he's named Sheremetyev. I mean, these families were very old and just kind of always served at the top of the elite. And so in my book, I just decided to simplify to the fact that I could simplify. I said, these are all counts and princesses. I think only Maria, the aunt, the girl's aunt, ended up, being a princess. She married into this princely family. But really, it didn't matter because all these families, they intermarried. They spent their childhoods together. They belonged to the same clubs, the same military groups. So it was really, it was whether they knew the Romanovs or not, as in the royal family, it was really their proximity to court. I would assume that a family, despite being counts and countesses, a family like the Sherbatskys, who was from St. Petersburg, would have known and been at court regularly. And I'll just add one more thing, which is kind of an interesting little fact, is that these families also married into the Romanovs. So an example was Felix Yusupov, who you may have heard about because he killed Rasputin. And he actually married into the royal family. He belonged to a very wealthy family. The Yusupovs were like the wealthiest family in Russia. And he actually married the niece of Nicholas II, so his sister's only daughter. And so that's an example of, and I think this is really interesting too, because I saw recently her name included the Sheremetyev name. So basically, like, they just all intermarried these kind of very, very old family. And all of them could theoretically have a claim to the throne too. So that's very interesting to me.
It is extremely interesting. And, the sisters do talk at one point about having play dates with Anastasia when they were children. And yet, as we know, these families do tend to keep the blood within the family, which was a very large factor in part of, I suppose, depending on who you want to ask, like the downfall or the paranoia of the Romanovs because of the hemophilia, I believe.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, oh
yeah.
definitely.
When you mention Rasputin, I mean the story is always that he had the Tsarina wrapped around his finger, and because she
Mhm.
was concerned about her son's hemophilia. But the families do, and we know this in general, that royal families do tend to kind of intermarry in general.
Yeah, and I mean the actual Nicholas II being kind of the heir to the throne would have been expected to marry a foreign princess. So, but yeah, I mean either way they were all interconnected. I mean they were all cousins, they were all,
Well, yeah, I mean
nephews.
that's for sure. I mean, you look at the royal family in England. I mean, there was connections there too. That's the royalty tended to stick together. But I did find the sisters just are really sympathetic narrators. I really liked Lilia and Irina. I know that we have this sort of, it's almost like a binary, like either you're for like royalty or you're for the people. But I think you did a really good job. These are just like, these are young women who basically had their entire world just shredded and everybody in their family murdered, and they were really trying to just get by. As you mentioned, they weren't even, they were relegated to this tiny little part of their house, and they were looking for jobs, and it was very difficult not to empathize with them because, as I'm sure, the revolutionaries, they looked at this house and they have so much and they're starving in the streets, but at the same time, like, they are still people, and they weren't, like, well, you need to get out or whatever. They were like, okay, this really sucks. How can we find a job? How can we stay alive? And I thought that they were extremely sympathetic, and experiencing just the ghostly phenomenon through their eyes was heartbreaking, because the house in and of itself, like you mentioned, like, these are really old families, had ghosts, and it was surprising.
The sisters really started it all for me because I learned about the real life sisters, the Sheremetyev family, and they lived in their ancestral house in Moscow, which is called the Corner House, which I kind of modeled Moscow House on. And it was just so unbelievable to me reading about these sisters. They actually did live in the attic of the house, and they were older than my sisters. I decided to make mine younger and kind of more inspired by the younger generations of the family, because you have to understand that the real life family, there were there were multiple branches of the family living in one house, relegated to a few of the rooms. The sisters that I'm talking about, they were kind of older. They had by then been married, they had lost their husbands. And I actually was so amazed by their story because they refused to believe their husbands were dead. And so they sort of just lived in the attic. They went to church, that's all they did. And they were treated with kind of a reverent respect by both the former people in the house as well as the Bolsheviks who lived there. I'm not going to call them Bolsheviks, but the Soviet men who lived there. It was actually a group of students in reality. And so that story just amazed me, and I was also inspired, like I said, by the younger generations of this family, because you kind of learn about them and their fates, and that they were very much affected by all the events that they lived through and that their family lived through. And, the older generations would try to keep the past alive, like my aunt does, and really teach their kids about where they came from and their families. But the young people, they just wanted to have fun. They were so done. They were so done with the past. They were so done with all the death and suffering. And they really just wanted to move on. They wanted jobs, they wanted careers, they wanted to go to school, and they did. But a lot of times it was just more complicated, They would maybe get a job, but it was all taken away either in the 20s or later in the 30s. We can't forget with Stalin came the purges. And that's when a lot of these people, even if they did get jobs, careers, and some of them did as professors, as actors, etc., but they lost all those jobs and sent to the camps. And it was just very, very heartbreaking to learn about kind of the fates of the real family. So I was very much inspired by kind of their survival and just general, I don't even know how to describe it, but just love of life. And despite the change, despite their fallen circumstances, they just wanted to live their lives. And that's what I really wanted to impart with my sisters, that they're young, they're girls, they're young women, and they just want to fall in love. They want to work, they want to live, and even in the hard circumstances that they're put in. Yeah.
That came through. So now that we're talking about the living, let's talk about the dead. Wow. Where did the ghosts of the house or the house itself awakening come from? There is a lot of folklore that's also woven into the narrative. Was it always synonymous with the ghost story as you began conceiving of the story?
I think so, simply because my first novel, The Witch and the Tsar, was much more centered on folklore. It's about the maligned Slavic witch Baba Yaga and a lot of other folklore fairy tale like characters, besides for kind of the historical time, the historical storyline of Ivan the Terrible. And with this book, I really wanted to continue with my love of folklore and fairy tales. I grew up on these stories, so to me, they're so part of me as a person and as a writer. And though I was changing the time period and I guess the genre as well, I definitely wanted to retain that folkloric spirit. And, it kind of started with the ghosts, but I knew I wanted to do something with folklore in the home because that's a big part of Slavic folklore. And I actually really wanted to include, I'm not going to spoil anything, but I wanted to include some characters in my first book that I never got to include because they just weren't that relevant. Whereas with this story, it was perfect because it's all about the home. And so I really wanted to include that. I just in the beginning didn't quite know how. And then it kind of came together throughout the drafting and editing process. But I knew I wanted a folkloric aspect.
Well, it was really effective, and you nailed the whole mood of a Gothic novel so well. I wanted to know, I guess, what are some of the classic Gothic horror stories or Gothic novels that inspired you on writing this particular one?
I'm a classics girl. I think my first love was classic literature. I remember, in high school reading Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen. Elizabeth Gaskell was a huge influence on me as well. And then later, The Haunting of Hill House. But all those novels were really, I think, just my first literary loves. It's what got me reading and got me into classic literature. And then, of course, I'm going to mention the monster Gothics, the Frankenstein, the Draculas, and other books like them, which I read and loved just for atmosphere, if nothing else. I don't know if I'm ever going to write about vampires or werewolves or any of that, but I love the atmosphere of those novels because they really inspired my love for dark fiction, which I think I started with my first novel and really continued here, obviously. But I also want to mention the Russian Gothic genre that a lot of people don't know about. Its founding father is a Ukrainian author called Nikolai Gogol. He lived in the first half of the 19th century and he wrote what you may have heard of Dead Souls. That's his famous work. But he also wrote a ton of short stories and ghost stories, stories about the paranormal, witches, demons, devils. And my grandfather actually loved Gogol, and he would read me Gogol when I was very small, like 5 years old, and show me the movies. And they were horrifying for a 5-year-old. And I remember I could not sleep for days afterwards, sometimes months, maybe years. Maybe that's why I can't sleep now. But having said all that, it really kind of influenced my love for ghost stories, for just dark fiction. I love that stuff. And I think that love started with fear, kind of like my love for Baba Yaga started with fear. And then lastly, I do want to mention a few contemporary novels that really had an effect in the writing of this particular novel. Um, you're going to know I'm mentioning Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and then The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. And as well as my friend Paulette Kennedy, who writes a lot of Gothic fiction. We actually were in the Quarrying Trenches together, and so she really influenced me in my writing. And I think all these novels really kind of convinced me, oh, the genre really isn't dead. I can do something with this. I can write something new using my experience, my culture, my background, and a new time period. And so I think that's how this book came about, is just being really inspired by other authors like me doing kind of regenerating the genre, making it new for modern readers.
Well, it was really great, and I really loved it. Like I said, the sisters are just such great characters. The house is a great character. Everybody is very interesting. You learn some stuff about history, which I always appreciate. So, do you have anything on the horizon at the moment?
I do. I am working on my third book. I don't have any news on that yet, but I should soon. And I almost have a first draft, which I just can't believe. It's been, uh, I feel like this is my first time really kind of getting in the zone with the whole publishing process in terms of like, I've been through this before where I'm working on one book, promoting another, kind of, yeah. But this is different because I feel like I'm balancing being a mom too, and my daughter's older now. And I feel like it's just been a process learning my own writing process. And so it's been a huge challenge, but I'm very proud of myself that I'm almost done with the draft. So very exciting, and hopefully it will be a real book soon.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. And we will be looking for this one on our shelves. So, audiences, thank you for listening. Check out The Haunting of Moscow House. And thank you very much, Olesya.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are now going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.